Testing. Testing 1, 2. Okay, I'm just going to take a seat over there, but then I'll... Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. We are speaking live from GEF-GCF Pavilion here at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. I would like to welcome our online viewers as well. It is my distinct pleasure to be moderating this morning's session and hope that everyone have had a very pleasant Saturday away from the COP venue and a relaxing one, of course. Very quickly, I'm Alvin and I work for UN Environment Programme. I'm representing the World Adaptation Science Programme Secretariat here. So we, over the course of last week, we've had numerous discussions, and I've been part of very different conversations on scaling up adaptation efforts. We've heard from world leaders and also from parties and observers, very different stakeholders in terms of very good adaptation efforts that are happening. Can I check with the technicians whether we are on live and whether we are being heard? Okay, all right. So we are live, right? So we've definitely had quite a lot of conversations at COP. We've seen very good adaptation efforts happening at different scales, local level, national, subnational, regional, and of course at global level. As we've heard also from world leaders, particularly that from the most vulnerable countries, the crucial and pressing need to amplify and scale up adaptation, action, and support, including finance. And what better way to actually build on these conversations at COP and outside of COP, noting that there are many voices outside of this room, with the WASP World Adaptation Science Programme launch of Policy Brief on Global Goal on Adaptation. So today's session, if we can move to the second slide, please. It's an event that has been organized by the World Adaptation Science Programme and partners. Very quickly, the World Adaptation Science Programme was officially launched at the 21st session of the COP, 24th session of the COP, that's COP24, in December 2018. The WASP, it's led by 7 agencies and organizations, and they include the United Nations Environment Programme, which is where I'm based, the World Met Organization, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, and the United Nations University. So this is truly an international partnership that is trying to scale up knowledge, science on adaptation. And one of the key things that the WASP has been doing is developing key policy brief on agenda items that really matters. One of the key things, of course, is the global goal on adaptation, which is where this session will focus on. The WASP has developed a state-of-the-art policy brief highlighting key messages. Today, at today's session, we will hear from the authors of the brief. We'll have a very brief technical presentation from Christy and and Joanna. Dr. Christy Ebby is from the University of Washington, and Dr. Joanna Nalau is from Griffith University from Gold Coast in Australia. So with further ado, I would like to invite the two authors to present very briefly on the policy brief. And maybe just sticking to time, we do have a fair about 1.5 hours, and if both of you would have 15 minutes to take us through the policy brief, and if you can touch on some of the highlight messages that our audience, both here and online, should be taking on the global goal on adaptation, and maybe also briefly mentioning what is this global goal on adaptation, why does it matter to us? Over to you two.
Thank you very much, Alvin. I'm Christy Ebi. I'm a professor at the University of Washington and one of the authors. Can you hear me well enough? Can you turn up the mic? They'll turn up the mic a little bit. It's ready to be swallowed, so I can't get any really closer than that. What we're going to cover in this brief is what is the mandate for the Global Goal on Adaptation, GGA, and how can it be operationalized. On the very last slide, we'll give you the QR code so you can download the policy brief yourself, and we hope that you will find it interesting and of some value. In terms of what is the mandate, of course, the Global Goal was named in Article 7.1 of the Paris Agreement. And so there is a mandate, and that's why there are negotiations here at COP27 on how to actually frame the global goal on adaptation and thinking about how it can be operationalized. And we'll spend most of our time talking about the operationalization of the global goal. In CMA 3, there is a 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh program was established on the global goal. And you can see the main points of the agreement of what needs to be done in this work program. This is all within the context of the temperature target. And so very much taking into account what's going on in the negotiations on the temperature target and how is it possible with the global goal to increase overall resilience to a changing climate. How can we facilitate adaptation, facilitate scaling up, making sure that we've got programs in place so that it's possible to do monitoring and evaluation and learning to understand where we are and where we need to be. So this brings together many different threads within the negotiation. These are some of the key messages from the policy brief. They're relatively obvious, but we hope that the summary is going to be useful. We need to monitor global adaptation progress to really understand whether or not national level indicators of vulnerability, resilience, and adaptive capacity are changing over spatial and temporal scales. How do we know that we're making progress? We need to understand the degree to which adaptation interventions influence the changes that we're observing. There's lots of other changes going on in society, not just adaptation, that within countries, the national development plans are making differences, and how are these intersecting in ways that reinforce both the efforts so that we can facilitate as quickly as possible ensuring that we protect the most vulnerable. We also then, as we do monitoring evaluation over time, need to understand how to modify adaptations as the climate and as development continue to evolve. There are many places that, as you know, are undertaking adaptation projects, but they don't necessarily explicitly incorporate climate change. They're looking much more at current climate vulnerability, and we do need to make sure that climate change is explicitly incorporated into these adaptation projects. Also, as I'm sure you're well aware, there's no agreed frameworks, methods, indicators, or metrics at the moment, and this is one of the key points that was negotiated last week and continue to be negotiated this week. One suggestion in the policy brief is to look at what countries are already doing. Countries are already undertaking national adaptation planning, conducting vulnerability and adaptation assessments, completing their NDCs, and to build upon these other processes to look at periodic national self-assessments of how countries are doing to move forward towards progress on adaptation. And to think about how to do that in a way that it can be added together. That every country has its own national circumstance that needs, of course, to be central to the actions on adaptation. But there also then needs to be efforts about what are the minimum indicators for what can be added across the different countries to be able to assess progress on adaptation. As implied in the previous slide, the current definition of the GGA does not specify what the GGA means for climate risk and vulnerability reduction, either now or in the future. I actually can't get it any closer to my mouth. My voice doesn't project it very well, and I'm doing the best I can. So yeah, so you want me to have it a little further away? I'm doing this as best as I can. Thank you. The policy brief talks about the need for a framework. This has been well discussed in the negotiations, where we have a robust approach to aggregate across scales and contexts. We need to assess the collective progress to inform the update and enhancement of national level actions. We have to look at how we can overcome challenges in evaluating adaptation, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that from the panel in a few minutes. That there are divergent views and political sensitivities that need to be taken into account. We do need to improve or establish long-term data sets. For many countries, this is a real constraint of the lack of long-term data sets. Along with that is the need to set baselines. We're measuring progress against what? And there has been lots of discussion and little consensus about what baselines could be. And then, of course, to provide more clarity and agreement on what counts as adaptation. One of the speakers that will come up is Professor Huck, who's been saying for years, if everything is adaptation, then nothing is adaptation, and to define the boundaries of adaptation. We need nationally appropriate, nationally driven, and contextually relevant approaches. Ideally, a relatively simple framework so that low and middle income countries can contribute because it's critical to understand how they're advancing in terms of adaptation. Again, establishing a baseline, making sure that the progress is transparent, trackable over time, flexible, and relevant. Those are relatively easy recommendations. They're a little bit challenging to operationalize, which Johanna will talk about in a few minutes. Because of the recommendation to build on what's already being done, we suggest in the policy brief to focus on country-level indicators and to see what can be taken from the country-level indicators, finding some consensus across countries, and to ultimately develop a technical guidance document on how to operationalize the global goal. This is a text-heavy slide. It covers the attributes one would like in indicators. I will not go through this in detail. It will be covered in the discussion, and you'll see it in the policy brief. Thinking about where to select indicators from, as I mentioned, countries have vulnerability and adaptation assessments, NAPs, NDCs, national communications or national reports, and biannual transparency reports. So we're not saying that countries should start afresh. We need to build on what's already there. We also need to identify where new indicators really are needed, where there's gaps that are critically important to fill. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning is needed to inform the scaling up, so we want to make sure that there's that linkage between the indicators and monitoring and evaluation.
All right, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay? Yep. Yeah, so the work program it's a 2-year work program that the UNFCCC, and it has 8 workshops. And in the policy brief, we also refer to the latest technical report that came out from UNFCCC. And that's really looking at the broad scale of all kinds of indicators, approaches, targets, and metrics to help the countries to start thinking, well, what would those kind of global level metrics would look like? So some are obviously suggesting to look at indicators on SDGs from Sendai, but there's lots and lots of from CBD, lots of different kinds of indicators that could be either included as they are or revised for GGA. And so there is also a call to start thinking about new indicators as well, but also a lot of discussion about how can we reduce the reporting burden, especially on the least developed countries, because they already have to report in so many different items. So that discussion is ongoing at the negotiations. Now, ironically, I will have to go after this because the GTA negotiations have not concluded, but there's a new session at 12. So we'll keep going with that. Can you put the next slide? Or maybe you do it. Oh. No, that's perfect. Yeah, the next one. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so the technical report was actually quite interesting because it looked at the existing indicators, but they also have a section on kind of future forward thinking. And this is one of the approaches that has been discussed so there was an informal kind of GTI workshop in Maldives in May, and they're starting to think about, well, what would global goal indicators look like? And this is one of the many proposals to look at, for instance, different levels. So in this one, you would have level 1, which is basically survival, and that would take the kind of minimum. What does it take to survive in a changing climate? Level 2 would be a stabilization, so kind of status quo. So reduce the impact of climate change and be able to keep going as we are. And level 3 would be to ensure sustainability and the fulfillment of SDGs. And level 4 would be looking at transformation, so an aspirational future for communities, for nations. What would that look like? And there's been a lot of discussion also, well, how can we envision the global goal in the future and then start mapping the steps how to get there in a collective sense. Okay. So in summary, what we looked at, the kind of key messaging from the policy brief is that obviously there is a need to define the relevant indicators, approaches, targets, and metrics, and there's a lot of work already happening within the work program towards that, and that's being discussed in the negotiations as well, which are still ongoing. But also developing guidelines so that enable comparability, aggregability, but ensuring that the indicators are not utterly complex, because if they are, then the countries will have really difficult time obviously reporting. So are there ways to have more simplified qualitative and quantitative indicators? So that's been, especially in the negotiations, has been a discussion point. And how can you have indicators that are also context specific, whether that's then more the kind of qualitative indicators and approaches. And building on existing tools and reports and reporting mechanisms, because there's a lot in the convention already, and would have a component of self-assessment. And promoting flexibility to reflect the country-drivenness, so really looking at the country level, as Chris said earlier. So those are the main highlights from the policy brief, and we have the QR code that also gives you then access to the actual policy brief, and we have it on the World Adaptation Science Programme website as well.
I'll try this one and let's see whether this mic works. No, thanks Christy and thanks Johanna for synthesizing the policy brief so succinctly. There were a couple of very technical elements, and what I got from your presentation was that this is a global framework that should be nationally driven. And by nationally driven, of course, we bring in the subnational elements and the local elements to it, which really becomes quite challenging to conceptualize such a framework. And Joanna, of course, quite a lot of points coming out from there. And one of the things we observe is increasing climate risks and the need and urgency to drive a global goal. And I know we've had this conversation in terms of mitigation, already having such a concrete way to measure. But with adaptation, this is almost like a visioning for the community. So it's good to kind of set this vision. I know, Joanna, you've got to leave soon for the negotiations. So I will welcome any clarifying questions, one or two, noting that we will have about 20 minutes dedicated, 20 to 30 minutes dedication just for discussions. So any quick clarifying questions from the floor? I'm not sure whether we'll be able to take any questions from online, but we'll do this very quickly. And please, if you can introduce yourself briefly and face the camera for online.
Hi, thank you. So where's the camera? Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, I want to address the panelists actually, but so. Okay, hi, my name is Timo Leiter. I'm from the London School of Economics, and I wanted to make this comment later, but actually I have to go to the negotiations, which are now in parallel to this event. I was just wondering, so I just browsed through the policy brief, and I think you made, Christy, first of all, you made a very important point that it's in the context of the temperature goal. Because, if you have a goal or a sub-goal to reduce vulnerability, but actually vulnerability is increasing because the risks are increasing. So we must not forget that. That was a very important point. The comment I wanted to make is I was surprised that you didn't cite the IPCC AR6 report, which has a cross-chapter box on how to assess global progress and adaptation, which would have been highly relevant. Maybe that could still be added. I think that would be very useful to do. And thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We did basically finish drafting before the IPCC report was released. It's been a while.
Yeah, hi, I'm Loy. I do encourage you all to talk a little bit more about building resilience. It's not about only measuring adaptation and its past, but building resilience and its future. And I know you've talked about it in broad terms. Can you hear me? I think we need to get down to more specifics, and a fund like yours, which is established within the heart of Asia, or one heart of Asia, one part of Asia, and with a global reach, can do a lot. So do expand on it, and we can articulate the demands and the expectations from it.
I wonder whether either of you would just want to briefly comment on the 2 points on the temperature and the resilient elements.
So, sorry, what was the first point?
So Timo's point was around how we can conceptualize perhaps the temperature goal in the GGA. And the next one was around resilience dimension to the global goal.
Thank you. And those are both, of course, strongly connected. And it underscores the point in the policy brief about focusing at the national level. And many countries, and we'll hear from this in the remarks from the panelists, are working very strongly to build resilience at all scales. And countries are, through their vulnerability and adaptation assessments, looking at local scales. We'll hear from Professor Huck about locally led adaptation. That's working very much at the local level on how to build resilience. And that's being aggregated up to the national level, is reflected in the national communications. Bangladesh is taking the lead in this area. Other countries are also working on this. You've also got significant funding coming through the various adaptation funds that are primarily at the local level, but designed to inform the national level vision for how the country can become more resilient. As I said, one of the challenges has been in some of the projects is not as explicitly as we need to incorporate climate change, to take into account that what you're doing today may not be useful in a decade from now under higher temperatures, and finding ways to move more quickly into that explicit incorporation of rapidly changing temperature, rapid changes in nature. We're seeing from IPBES of all the changes in nature, and of course the country development plans, and making sure that there is coherence across those.
Thanks. And in terms of building resilience and adaptive capacity, the technical report from the UNFCCC also looks at different examples of that. So we have Professor Hugh here. So Bangladesh, for instance, has this climate prosperity plans, which is kind of broader resilience than just adaptation, than just mitigation. I'm sure he will talk to you about that as well.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Joanna, for your time. And know that you are in between many other sessions, so thanks for taking your time for this. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can just thank our presenters. For those who are tuning in live, welcome to the launch of the World Adaptation Science Programme Science-for-Adaptation Policy Brief on Global Goal and Adaptation. We are live from COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The next part of our session, we will have a number of panelists, and I would like to invite my panelists to please join me here on stage so that Christy, maybe, yes, just stay here. You may actually have questions afterwards. Our next few speakers, we have Chi Akoy from the Global Environmental Facility. I will try my very best to introduce all of you very briefly. And Chi is the lead environmental specialist for the GEF programming unit, and GEF is one of the partners for the World Adaptation Science Programme. Next, we have with us Anne Olf. Anne Olf is the International Senior Advisor for Denmark's green think tank, which is Concito. I hope I got that right. Then we have Alvaro. Alvaro is the Senior Project Associate at the United Nations University, and in his current role, he looks after economics of adaptation, and that's one of the areas that he has researched. And we have Dr. Salim Haq. Professor Haq is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University at Bangladesh. He is one of the champions for locally led adaptation, also inspiring quite a lot of youths and young people across the world. So Professor Huck, welcome. And we do have someone from Green Climate Fund. I unfortunately don't have an introduction, so maybe if you can quickly introduce yourself, and he is replacing Pa Osman Jaru.
Yes, our director Pa was not able to, due to unforeseen circumstances, to join us today. So I will be representing him and the GCF on this panel. My name is Alisher Mamajanov. I'm a climate policy and governance specialist with the fund.
Thank you. For the next round, each of our panelists will have a 5-minute pitch. A 5-minute pitch in terms of their vision, their thinking around global goal and adaptation, and building on the technical presentation made by Christy and Joanna. So each of you would have briefly 5 minutes, and I will have to stop you at 5 minutes simply because we do want to give our audience some time to actually respond, but also get in a conversation with you. In what order should I start? I will start with Chi, yourself. You are listed first. Then we will move to GCF, followed by Alvaro, N, and then Dr. Huck, yourself. Over to you, Chi.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to be very loud. I will speak as loudly as I can because I want to make sure that you can hear. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to co-host this event with the GCF colleagues. I'm very, very happy that this particular event was able to take place, because I do think what we're talking about here, the global goal adaptation and how the elements would need to translate into specific programs, projects, national level efforts, but also local level efforts, is extremely important. I don't think that's being emphasized enough. And I'm also glad, serendipitously, we're having this conversation on day one of the second week, because it's a very good timing to start bringing these elements into those of us who are also in a position to observe or participate in the negotiation sessions. So with that, let me first and foremost say, for the GEF, the whole notion of global goal adaptation, we already enshrined it in our strategy for the next 4 years. Okay, so we're saying our goal for the GEF adaptation programming is to facilitate transformational adaptation in developing countries towards achieving the Paris Agreement's global goal in adaptation. And we did this because we're entrusted to do so, and with very clear understanding that there are a lot of uncertainties, if you will, on how that could be translated into action, how those could be, how the goals could be conceptualized, quantified, qualified, data gathered, data analyzed, and fed back into the system to make some sense out of it. Okay, so what we hear from the first panel is extremely relevant, in the sense that there has to be some level of agreed upon frameworks as well as indicators that would need to be utilized and introduced. And I heard that very clearly as a message to the GEF, and I would have to say that was a message that's very clearly sent to the GCF, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are entrusted to support the programs and projects on adaptation as the operating entity of the financial mechanism for this convention. But I would even argue for the GEF, we're also entrusted to support the country to enhance their transparency of action, as well as transparency of support for the Paris Agreement. Also, another point that I wanted to put on the table is that they're having quite a bit of efforts, first on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation side, between the GEF, the GCF, Adaptation Fund, as well as PPCR, for instance. Can we come up with a common set of indicators or analytical frameworks? Because that would only help countries, as well as project proponents and program proponents, to really focus on highlighting how the interventions at the end of the day would be measured. And the more clarity we have on what those indicators and methodologies are, and the more common, the harmonized approach we have, we also know that that would actually much more beneficial for the ecosystem, if you will, of institutions, countries, local organizations, academic institutions that are working to really quantify and be able to report back on adaptation benefits, as well as what still needs to be done. So what we heard today is very important, and also just wanted to share that on the side of the GEF and GCF, at this point, I think the common denominator, if you will, is still going to be as broad as number of beneficiaries and number of hectares of land. And then we start to go into a lot more non-core, if you will, indicators that we would have, the GCF would have. And then I think it's time for us to really start thinking about some of these non-core indicators that need to be sort of conceptualized within the framework of global goal and adaptation to move forward. So we're very excited from the perspective of the GEF, and if I can speak for GCF, that this effort is ongoing as part of the WASP, right? And also the brief, let me just say a few words about this. It's very hard for the GEF alone or GCF alone to send this message, right? We talk to the agencies, we talk to the countries, but it's a lot easier for us to be able to send the message. There is merit as well as there needs to be attention paid on this particular issue, and having a brief like this, that's fairly easy to understand, and to tell them this is where the state of play is, and this is where we're going to try to move ahead as a WASP as well as this ecosystem of partners is very, very useful. So thanks to the WASP as well as authors for working on this. We will continue to be engaged in this effort. So I hope that was my 5 minutes. Thanks.
No, thanks, Chi, for putting it very well into...
And it's Chiz.
Cheers. So sorry. Cheers. Thanks so much for putting that so succinctly, and how important it is in terms of conceptualizing some sort of measurement framework, but also what goes in this framework is important, given that adaptation is so diverse. And of course, it's a must now, but it's also, we've got to start thinking from the future dimension as well. So Cheers, thanks much, and I would like to give the floor to Green Climate Fund now, please.
Yep. Thank you very much, and also thanks a lot, Cheese, for actually providing perspective. Also, I think on behalf of other climate funds, all of us, why it's so important to work together on methodologies, indicators, parameters for measuring actually our progress on adaptation. And GCF as a fund, which is from the beginning in its design, in the governing instrument, is committed to working in the balance between adaptation and mitigation 50-50. We're almost there. We're now at 49-51 ratio. We, of course, adaptation for us is really really fundamental area of work. And in terms of measuring our impacts, one of the recent developments is Integrated Results Management Framework, IRMF, which was adopted by our board, which actually gives us really a tool to measure both those key indicators that Cheese has actually mentioned in terms of number of beneficiaries, but also going a bit deeper and into different areas of adaptation. We have 4 adaptation-related result areas, so going a bit deeper into water sector, going deeper, for example, in agriculture, health sector, and have some supplementary indicators that help us measure how well we are doing. So in that sense, this WASP initiative and the briefing, brief that was just released, will be very important to inform our work in the future of all climate funds and GCF, especially that GCF is now actually embarking on, the board is now working on the update of our strategic plan. So basically, shaping how we will be functioning for the next 4 years for our second replenishment period, 24-27. And at the same time also we are now embarking on update of our readiness program. So why I'm mentioning readiness program, in the readiness program we were providing also tools for countries for national adaptation planning and funding, of course, most importantly. And so far actually we have approved 87 NEP grants to support countries to come up with their coherent national adaptation plans, where of course they will, most importantly, to start with, measure vulnerabilities and risks, and so that they could really map up what are the most urgent areas of intervention, which our hope is will translate also into investment plans, and project pipelines which will come to GCF and other funds too. And maybe just to finish here, I just want to highlight 2 important also updates from our side. So this year, the GCF board has adopted guidance, a decision on guidance on our vision, scope, and approach for adaptation activities, which actually sets up also a vision how we'll be working on, including also translating national adaptation plans into projects. And of course, we have their different pillars like transformation planning, catalyzing innovation. Of course, de-risking is also important. So, having a wide instrument of wide financing instruments, we can also help to catalyze private sector financing into adaptation. And we have already examples of that. And of course, also aligning finance with sustainable development. So greening also the finance sectors in countries. So this is one. There's a guidance document, and another important document that the fund has approved is what we call a document, guidance on demonstrating impact potential of mitigation and adaptation projects, which actually will guide countries and our accredited entities in what we are seeking, including in terms of data that is needed to show the climate science basis of adaptation projects. So this is also a very important aspect. So the board has clarified how you need to demonstrate that you have actually searched through different sources of data, and including indigenous data, indigenous knowledge, local data, and academic resources, of course, data available in hydromets if it is. And once you demonstrate that you've done your best, so you have best available knowledge and submitted your project, this would be sufficient to justify an adaptation intervention from our side. So again, really would like to welcome this important initiative, which will inform and guide us. And again, we as climate funds working very closely on these issues. And of course, we cannot, we need measurement tools to see our progress. Otherwise, we cannot even have a benchmark. So this is important also in terms of GGA, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And there were quite a lot of elements over there. And what I got from Chiz and your point was a set of common framework indicators that would help us measure progress, but also accelerate progress. And of course, a key dimension to this is being able to address climate risks now and in future. And I thought that maybe Alvaro from United Nations University, you'd be able to touch a little bit in terms of climate risk management, and particularly maybe talking a bit in terms of how climate risk finance, as you've heard from GEF and GCF, could be integrated into such a framework, but also your pitch. What are you thinking in terms of this work program and the global goal? Over to you, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Alvin, for the question, and thanks to all of the colleagues. I think we're going to overlap in several of our points today. I think from UNU-EHS, we have like 3 points we wanted to highlight in these 5 minutes. The first one is a recommendation that the global goal on adaptation directly reflects on ambition on vulnerability and exposure reduction. The second one is we need a focus on capacity building, which is also linked to all the conversations we're having here in finance. We know there's a primary need. We know there is a lot of science out there, but access to science is limited. And finally, regarding the GLASS program, I think something that the colleague Christy also pointed out, there is a need for the GGA to have an operated framework. So those are kind of the 3 points that we wanted to highlight. In terms of vulnerability and exposure reduction, at UNU-EHS, we have identified priorities that I think are shared for both risk management but other dimensions of adaptations. And those include equity, ecosystem, capacity building and finance, and finally interconnectedness. At UNU-EHS, we acknowledge and we've been very keen in working in projects that don't address these issues in silos, but that understand that both mitigation and adaptation are connected, but the hazards are connected and the solutions should also be interconnected. In terms of capacity building, as I said, there is a lot of knowledge out there, but maybe the knowledge is not necessarily available at a local level. The science and the indigenous knowledge that is there, it's not leveraged. So there is an opportunity in this capacity building to be a both sides approach in which we learn from and they learn from whatever science has to offer there. This includes also future scenarios. We were also listening before that there is a lot of adaptation done for today's scenario, but future scenarios are often not considered. There are a lot of uncertainties there, so that is an opportunity there to work. But it can be built, co-produced. We believe that their investments in open source platforms are important, in which collaboration is encouraged, but it's also available for everyone to chip in. And then, as I said, finally, there is a need on this for the GLASS program. We've been following closely. There is need for a programmatic approach that deal with different things like priorities. For example, we need to set some priorities. We need to also connect the glass with other UNFCCC mechanism. I think, Alvin, you're much more of an expert on this than I am, but in terms of the global stocktake, for example, how is the global stocktake inform the global goal on adaptation and the other way around? And then, yeah, I think with this I close, otherwise I will go into many details, but thank you.
No, thanks, Alvaro, for that point. And I take that point around indigenous people's knowledge, particularly knowledge that could help close some crucial adaptation gaps. And so one of the things we've been having a lot in our conversation is how do you actually accelerate adaptation while you do have adaptation gaps and challenges? And this is quite crucial given the breadth of knowledge that already exists and how adaptation actions could actually build on these kind of actions. With that, we'll transition and to you. And perhaps if you can give a pitch, I understand you're a member of the World Adaptation Science Programme and you're a committee member. And the WASP has been doing quite a fair bit of briefs in terms of closing knowledge gaps. So maybe from that perspective, if you can come in and say a few words in terms of what are the key adaptation gaps at the global level, how could you build on these lessons, adaptation gap report, and the work that WASP has done in the global goal for adaptation work. Over to you.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me, or I can try to speak up even more. So yes, that's true. I have the pleasure of being on the World Adaptation Science Programme Finance and Policy Committee, and I've also had the pleasure of being engaged in the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report since they started. And actually the very first UNEP Adaptation Gap Report came out in 2014, so before the Paris Agreement, and made the point that of course adaptation is local and has to be seen in a local and context-specific context, but it's definitely also a global challenge, and it needs global attention, it needs global action and global solutions. So this first report actually argued for a global goal on adaptation, and it also argued for viewing adaptation as a global challenge. And of course that's based on what we see. We see that the climate risks we're facing all across the world have many similarities. We see droughts, we see floods, we see heat waves, and also many of the solutions will be similar across different contexts. So that was sort of the starting point for the adaptation gap report. And what we have been looking at is basically, yes, gaps, different types of gaps, primarily at the global level. And what we see is that there are gaps all across all areas and across all dimensions. What we've been focusing specifically on in the adaptation gap reports is finance gaps, so gaps between the needs and what we actually see, finance gaps, and then we're focusing a lot on looking into planning and implementation of adaptation as well. So these are the three core dimensions we're looking at continuously across the reports, and my former colleague Henry Neufeld is sitting right there, is the chief scientific editor of the adaptation gap report and can fill in on more details. But if we just turn to the finance gap, what we see is the gap currently that the finance needs are 6 to 10 times higher than the available funding. So that's just to mention a very obvious gap. But we also see gaps in other areas, and what we see in particular is that while we're getting better at measuring sort of planning and processes and outputs, we are very far from being able to actually assess outcomes. So what is the extent to which what we're doing with the adaptation measures we're implementing, the capacity we're building, does it actually have an effect on reducing vulnerability? So that's where we need to focus more attention, I think. And also we see from a lot of the countries that are building up monitoring and evaluation systems that the primary focus is on the monitoring rather than the evaluation. And the learning is also lagging behind as we see it. So there's a large scope to make progress in those areas. How can we then support what's going on here, and how can we support countries in moving forward? we heard a lot about indicators, and we have hundreds and hundreds of indicators. So I don't think we're lacking indicators. What we're lacking is much more clarity and specificity on what is it that we want to measure. So, tell me what you want to measure, and I'll make you some suggestions and indicators. So I don't think we need to focus so much on creating new indicators. We need to focus on much more on what is it exactly that we want to measure, and then find the right indicators, including indicators on the outcome side. So yeah, let me end here and pass it over to Celine.
Yeah, you're ending with a very important questions in terms of what is exactly that we want to measure. And I think, this is something that's puzzling practitioners, climate negotiators over here. Obviously, quite a lot of momentum has been built, and we need to build on ongoing initiatives where there are existing indicators, but also financing gaps as well, as I heard from you. This is somewhat 5 to 10 times lower than what's actually needed to implement adaptation. So sorry about that. Okay, so we transition now to a slightly different area. Professor Huck. Is it safe to speak now? Okay. We will transition now to locally led adaptation. And I understand that I'm going to try, okay. Too many, all right. I will pass this on to you. Professor Huck, please, over to you. I'm not going to say anything else.
Okay, thank you. I hope this microphone works without screeching in our ears. So thank you very much, Alvin, and thank you for inviting me to this event. And as you've already heard mentioned several times, my focus is on locally led adaptation. But before I come to that, let me also share a little bit about reflection on the overall global goal on adaptation. Right? So in Paris, this was something that the vulnerable developing countries, particularly the Africa group of negotiators, were very keen to have as an equivalent to the mitigation goal of 1.5 degrees. But we understood it's much more complicated. There isn't a number, and a 1.5 equivalent of adaptation. But we nevertheless pushed for having a global goal as a matter of principle. And we got it in the Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. But we realized that we're far from agreeing on it. So then we started working on it. Now we have the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, 8 workshops, several of them done already, hopefully a few more to go. And I think we're converging on a way forward in dealing with it. So the overall comment I have is that it's complex. We may have a global framework, but then the application of that will have to be very nation-specific, even location-specific. And I would like to argue for a very specific cohort of people to be prioritized. And those people are the most vulnerable people on the planet, all right? They used to be mostly in developing countries. They're no longer mostly in developing countries. They're also in developed countries. In fact, Hurricane Ian has displaced a whole bunch of Americans in Florida, all right? They've lost their homes. They have been affected by the impacts of climate change, and they need to be helped to adapt to it. And they're not prepared for it, okay? So adaptation is a global public good that everybody will have to do, rich and poor, developed and developing. But from a perspective of doing the analysis and then financing and support, I feel morally we need to focus on the most vulnerable, all right? And if we do that, then there are 2 things we should avoid doing. Firstly, avoid thinking of them as victims and ourselves as some kind of champions coming to help them. They're not targets, they're not beneficiaries. They are people with knowledge and experience of their own, which I would argue is actually far superior to ours in terms of the problems that they are facing. And so we must recognize them as co-designers of whatever it is that we hope to do, recognize their knowledge and experience, and find a way to blend it with our so-called higher level of information and technology that we bring to the problem. And the good news is this is happening. It's happening now more and more all over the world. And just to plug a little bit of what we do from my center, we have an annual event called Gobeshona, which is has evolved into a global event, started as a national event in Bangladesh, where we bring together local level adaptation practitioners, researchers from all over the world. We run it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, with sessions starting in the Australia Pacific time zones for 8 hours, and the Africa, Europe time zones for 8 hours, and then the Americas for 8 hours, and then we go around the world again. And we have 100 sessions from all over the world, a mixture of practitioners, researchers, policymakers, funders, donors, sharing what they're doing. And that's expanding very, very fast. So the final point I'll make in terms of a contribution to the global goal, we have to have something on adaptive capacity of the most vulnerable. And it could be numbers, but I would prefer a more qualitative assessment as well as just people. And then aggregating that in terms of communities coming together within an ecosystem, cities, towns, and then at the national level. And that's something we are working on in Bangladesh, trying to do a bottom-up assessment of tracking progress on adaptation. And it's very much a tracking progress. If it's not an ideal, everybody is now adapted. But how are we making progress? And make a final pitch for self-evaluations, not external evaluations, but people evaluating their own progress, setting their own goals, and then evaluating their own progress toward goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Huck. I'll give this a shot. So we've had quite a range of very different views from our panelists, and of course the last one on locally led adaptation. One of the interesting things is that we initially started off with community-based adaptation, amplifying local voice at the global level, but now it's at a point where we've had quite a few adaptation, or in fact history of adaptation action. So it's about amplifying some of the good best practices in such global frameworks. For those who you are joining live, welcome to the launch of the Adaptation Policy Brief. There is a QR code on your screen, so if you would like to download the policy brief, please do that. It's available online. We will now transition into a discussion with our wonderful panelists. We've had Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility. We've had UNU and yourself from the WASP, and we've had Professor Huck from ICAD. I would now turn and give this opportunity to our audience for a conversation with our panelists, and we'll start with you, Henrik. If you can please introduce for the benefit of others, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Henry Neufeld. I'm with the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. And okay, I've been, as Anna introduced, I've been leading the adaptation gap reports. And I wanted to add a little bit on the specific topic that we had this year on adaptation effectiveness. This was sort of one of the key issues in addition to the main foci on finance, planning, and implementation. And the conclusion of the report was that adaptation practice as it is, effectiveness, is really, really poor. And we know now why that is. It's because of inadequate involvement of stakeholders, lack of attention to local contexts, retrofitting development actions as adaptation, short-term focus, and failing to address social transformation and climate justice. So these are the real issues that we've identified being the reasons why adaptation practice is so poor. And we put together a few principles, which I'm not going to read right now, but I invite everybody to read at least the executive summary of this year's Adaptation Gap Report. Now let me take the opportunity to, because having this microphone, to go a bit further beyond the global goal on adaptation, because I think we've been talking about the national level. So basically what we need to identify first is a national goal on adaptation before you can, and then you can aggregate it. And I believe, I fully support what Salim has been saying about self-evaluation. This is a country-driven process. So the countries identifying their national goals on adaptation, which they must identify, determine, and plan together with, from national to subnational to local scales, and having this conversation with the stakeholders to enable to start identifying and articulating their national goals. And then they can measure over the global stock takes in iterative processes the progress in relative terms. And that's what the global goal on adaptation can then capture. It isn't about having a perfect set of indicators. It's about having indicators that are nationally approved, appropriate, and that can then be used to measure progress in relative terms. Thank you.
Thank you, and particularly the point around nationally led goals as well. And quite a lot of work is happening in the space of developing national adaptation plans, which will be quite important. We'll take at least 2 or 3 more comments and questions, and then I'll pass it on to the panelists to respond. If you can briefly introduce yourself, Martin.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Yes, it's working? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Martin Capel. I'm head of the Secretariat of the World Adaptation Science Programme. I mean, we have a fantastic panel here today. It's really impressive, the level of experts we have and the participation as well, including here Dr. Chris Ebai and Jenna Nalau, who had to go. I would love to ask the group of panelists, members of the WASP, what do you see as the top 3 topics for future WASP briefs? You know, what is out there? What is at the horizon? What do we need to address going forward as key topics that we would need to work on to develop policy briefs as input to the next COP? It's very important that we look forward and think about what is out there, what's around the corner that we need to address in this kinds of policy briefs that are endorsed by 7 UN agencies, partly represented here at the podium. That's the question I have. Thank you so much, Alvin.
Thanks, Martin. I'm certainly not part of the panel to answer your question. I'll have a bilateral with you in terms of future priorities. But Christy, please.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of your remarks. They were really very helpful, and appreciate that the policy brief is of value to some of your organizations. And I want to follow up with comments from Henry and some things that Salim said of there's so many really vulnerable places that are trying to fill their adaptation gap. And at the same time, we're now facing extreme events that are virtually impossible without climate change. We're looking at rapidly approaching tipping points and how to think about not just scaling up, but in bringing different elements into these dialogues at the local scale. So it's not just about historic experience, it's about a future they can't imagine, and how to be more effective and more efficient so that we know we can build resilience to climate change and not just be filling in the hole from our adaptation gap. Thanks.
Thank you. And I have one more question. If you can please come over here for visibility of our online participants, and if you can introduce yourself, please.
Great, thank you. So my name is Jesse DiMaria-Kinney. I'm with the Adaptation Research Alliance. And we've heard a lot about, of course, the goal, the indicators, kind of the national level, and the need for aggregate. But I had another question, and I think it was touched on a bit by the local level, maybe subnational. I think a lot of this has to do with also processes and kind of capacities. And so I'm particularly curious to know what Dr. Hook would think, but of course everyone on the panel. How can we ensure that there's actually national capacity in place to develop the targets at the national level, to avoid kind of the fly-in, fly-out, international institutions or consultants going to the national level over and over? I think it's, for the sustainability of any goal at the national level or local level, there's that national capacity that's required.
Thanks. Those were some very good questions. So the way I probably want to divide this is we've had one question in terms of reflections from Adaptation Gap Report and how we integrate that, and perhaps if I can pass that cheers to you and to Green Climate Fund to maybe respond on that element. And Alvaro, question around future scales and vulnerability. And then, of course, Christie's question, of course, Salim, if I can pass it on to you. And perhaps both of you, Salim, and if you can come from the perspective of what should be or what could be some of the future priorities of WASP Brief.
Thank you. So I'm just going to answer some of the very interesting inquiries that have been put on the table. I'm going to go with the first one with Christy, and this is probably not the not in the chronological order. Look, if you're looking at addressing the issues of adaptation, and as you rightfully said, we're trying to fill the holes, and holes are getting bigger, and holes are actually appearing everywhere else, right? I think there comes a point at which, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not representing the GEF in this particular view. I think there comes a point at which we really should not be just focusing on climate finance to really start to fill these holes, because in terms of the speed of mobilization, no matter how hard we try, the climate funds at the end of the day are put in place to address climate relevant issues, and there's always going to be difficulties in terms of the speed of really justifying the climate relevance of a lot of interventions. The floods, the hurricanes, and so on and so forth, right? So, in the scope and the scale, at the GEF, we have billions, right? GCF will go into the replenishment. They will have billions, right? But some of the things we're talking about is just 2 orders of magnitude more than that, right? So should we be actually thinking about really having a more of an honest conversation on how to mobilize emergency responses, right? Should we be having conversations more on the security issues? Because these are, at the end of the day, about national security, global security, and security of the planet, right? So can we actually be having a little bit more nuanced, honest conversation on how do we go about the intersection, if you will, of the holes we're starting to see and the more of the frequency? So my boss is probably in there, maybe he's having a heart attack. Anyway, on the question somebody raised on how do you incorporate capacity elements, as well as how do you make sure those are within the countries and context. The honest answer is that every single project and program we get, and I'm sure the GCF is in the same position, we're always asking who is going to be your partner on the ground. What are the institutions, what are the initiatives that will help you not just sort of be around the table as a stakeholder, but the solution providers who are going to be implementing this, right? In a way, it's a fancy way for us to say it's the whole of society approach, but this is really important to us, right? We ask this question, and we are also becoming a lot more explicit that we don't want, as the GEF, the 18 GEF agencies to be doing the day-to-day implementation on the ground. That's an exception. It should actually be done by the executing partners. And we're really trying to focus this attention to it. There are circumstances, right, in the areas where there is really no particular expertise available. Then, of course, we can talk about bringing in the international expertise. And there are always elements where you want to have some level of comparability as well as coordination among different initiatives. So we're not denying that there are always room as well as context to have international institutions and international expertise. But at this point, the premise of what we want to do in terms of support providing on the ground, they have to be locally specific in, with the engagement of much, much more robust local institutions, national institutions, regional institutions, and so on and so forth. Sorry, I'm ignoring your
I'm
marching
gonna
orders. Sorry about that.
Cheers. Thanks.
Can I just say one more? Okay. You, Martin, you asked about what we want to see. I would love to see a lot more scientific and nuanced analysis on the whole issue of vulnerability. Okay? What does that really mean? Because we're asking this question because how does that at the end of the day inform financing decisions? And that's the piece that we're very clearly missing at this point. And I'm saying this on behalf of the GEF because we tried to do that in the last replenishment negotiations, and we were just unable to get to that stage. But we have agreement for the next replenishment. This is something we really need to look into. So if WASP could do that, that'd be great. Thanks.
GCF, please.
Yes, thanks. Is it working? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Yes, indeed. Thank you for some very interesting reactions and questions. Just to echo what she said, we are all of the climate funds together. Even if we take a 100 billion goal under the convention, we are only a few percent of that. We represent together maybe not more than 5, even less, percent of that 100 billion. So of course, all our money together would not be enough to address all the challenges, and we need much more than those 100 billion. So of course, it means we need to catalyze something, and one of them is of course private sector. Again, just to repeat, again, it's not easy at all, but there are some solutions and possibilities. We have one, for example, one project in GCF, quite recent one, Global Coral Reef Fund, which actually is planning to, with a 125 million, I think, funding from us, catalyze overall, in total for the fund, $500 million dollars to help address the issue of protection of coral reefs. And this is just one example. So maybe as a potential brief, one of the future ones that could be on actually attracting or catalyzing investment in adaptation for private sector or otherwise. This is also one of the possibilities. Coming to also the question of national targets. I think that one of, again, I already mentioned today, NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. So ideally this should be a process which would actually bring together all stakeholders in the country to work on these targets, but based on solid vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, and looking where are the main priorities to set targets to decrease vulnerability, improve adaptive capacities across different sectors, for example, and then maybe as the next step to go into sectoral adaptation plans that actually we also can support in GCF preparation of such plans. Again, it's very difficult to set targets in adaptation, and moreover, we know that adaptation project cycle is much longer than mitigation, and in order to see the results, and you have to wait much longer. So that's also one of the issues which makes it difficult to measure adaptation impact. And of course, here in this process, indeed, local capacities are very important. And we see that, of course, for example, in LDCs, least developed countries, this is something which is really difficult to bring and to retain. Again, we have means to support NDAs, for example, our national designated authorities and other governance structures in countries. But again, it will not help, maybe some structural issues, fundamental issues of national capacities. But so it really requires more systematic approaches to it. quick reaction. So a lot to do still, but we know at least some of the ways how to address it, and yeah.
No, thank you. And one of the sticky issues, of course, in terms of realizing ambition is finance. And, there's a vital role, of course, for the financial mechanism, particularly GEF and GCF, in terms of, conceptualizing some of the finance or means of support element in such a framework. But Alvaro, if I can turn to you and if you can just respond to probably what Christy had been talking about from the vulnerability side, and very briefly, if you can say a few things.
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna focus on capacity building because I find it to be the connecting line within all of the questions and inputs that we receive, right? So again, I have 3 points. The first point would be in the topic of exchanging the knowledge that is there. There is local knowledge, there is academic knowledge, and the question is how to bring this knowledge together to strengthen each other, right? So there is need for investment in that regard. In terms of vulnerabilities, I would add to the complicated question that she already put, the idea that we're building new vulnerabilities, like urbanization and rapid urbanization. So when we talk about future scenarios, we talk about climate change, but we also know our societies are changing, and there are other factors like conflict that are there. So how are we going to build capacities so that all these growing elements are out there, right? And then the last part, as well, when we were talking about concept for WASP, the new reports, what should they be? My question would be for a new report in the future would be, how is science building capacities? Are we just creating knowledge? Are we co-creating knowledge? Are we bringing this knowledge to those who need it? So there is funding, there is need for funding for research, but there also needs to be funding targeted to create tools and to building the capacities to use those tools for decision making and resilience improvement. I cut it there.
Yeah, thanks, Alvaro, and Salim, yourself, if you can just say a few things in terms of responding to the questions.
Thank you. Let me also start, picking up the torch here on the capacity building aspect, because I think one thing that's clear is that you can't separate adaptation from development. So 1 year we actually looked into, in the adaptation gap report, into indicators of adaptive capacity, and they were 99% development indicators. So this is about development, not only for what we call least developed countries, but also for countries with high income levels. On the topic of what would be interesting for the World Adaptation Science Programme to look into, I think this goes beyond the concept of policy briefs, but I really think it would be interesting if the WASP and others could look beyond the global stocktake process that goes on within the UNFCCC and think out of the box in terms of providing a science-based way of approaching, measuring progress on adaptation. We have it very much with all the scenario work on the mitigation side, and I'm sure we could move forward and make progress on the adaptation side as well. Secondly, because they were asked for 3, and maybe Salim will pick up on this, I don't know, but 2 related points. Loss and damage. It's definitely a rising attention area, and it's sort of loss and damage is basically starts where adaptation possibility ends. So the whole sort of spectrum of from development to adaptation to loss and damage. And related to that, I think the whole area of the scope for reducing vulnerability through adaptation and the limits to that would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I just want to, I'll pick up on that, exactly what she had mentioned in terms of financing also needed in terms of responding to increasing disasters as well. And I know, Salim, you've been engaged in the loss and damage discussions over here, and maybe you can add and top up some of the points from that side.
Sure, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. So I'll start with Jesse's point, and it's already been picked up by several panelists, on capacity building. To me, that's the key. And it's not capacity building of poor people. It's capacity building of all of these people. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. Henry pointed out they poured money in and it wasn't effective. All right, so they did things wrong because they didn't know what they were doing. They need to know what they're doing. So capacity building is a brief for everybody, everywhere on adaptation. It's our job to try and do that, is to improve their knowledge and capacity. The other element that I think is important for us is we are now, as Anna said, reaching the limits of adaptation. And, we're now segueing into loss and damage. And COP21 is the first COP in the new era of impacts of climate change now being attributable and happening. And they're going to get worse. Every COP from now on is going to get worse. We're not ready. We're not prepared on adaptation. So we need to be thinking in terms of how do we segue from adaptation. So in the loss and damage jargon, we use avert, which maps to mitigation. We use minimize, that maps to adaptation. And then we now have crossed the Rubicon into address, because it's already happening. And we need to find, us, the scientific community, is to find ways to understand that spectrum, and then where do we do interventions and what can we do. The final point I'll make is that we tend to have a fixation on finance. I don't believe finance is the critical missing link. Missing link is thinking. People applying their own minds, thinking out of the box. We are in a brand new situation. We have not figured it out. We got hit by COVID, we had hit the war. Climate change is even bigger than all of that. We need to be thinking out of the box, and we need to be thinking globally. So that, where I'm a proponent of locally led adaptation, but I'm an absolute supporter of a global goal on adaptation, where everybody on planet Earth needs to be involved in building their own capacity and understanding, and then doing something about the problem. That's the global goal. 8 billion people on planet Earth understanding the problem and doing something about it.
Professor Huck, I'm going to hold you on this, okay, and then I'll come back to Green Climate Fund. As Anne mentioned, now that we're approaching possible limits to adaptation and possible segue into this loss and damage, how can such a global goal be conceptualized to bring in those elements of limits to adaptation?
Well, one way of talking about both mitigation and adaptation is to avoid loss and damage. I mean, that's why we have the convention. It's to avoid loss and damage from human-induced climate change. 30 years now, we haven't achieved it. It's happened, all right? And so now we are in a brand new situation where we're going to have to deal with the crisis as it's happening, at the same time as preparing to prevent an even bigger crisis in the future. All right, so that's what mitigation is going to do. Mitigation 1.5, if we don't achieve it, then 1.5.1 has to be our goal, and then 1.5.2 has to be our goal, and then every fraction counts. Because even at 1.1, we are seeing impacts and loss and damage. So 1.5 is no safe trajectory. It was just an arbitrary level that we agreed to, and we're not keeping to it. And so we, as I said, we're in a brand new situation now. And we need to be thinking out of the box and not in our traditional mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, sequential thinking anymore. The problem has superseded all of that.
Yeah. And just as one of the respondents had mentioned, the temperature goal has to be kept alive in such a goal. I do know, GCF, you want to say, and if you can succinctly just summarize it, because I want to go back to the audience and give them an opportunity to have a conversation with you all.
Thanks. So just, can you hear me now? Yep. Just a quick also reaction, and of course realizing that maybe for WASP as a science program, we're, private sector and private sector finance could be a bit maybe too wide, a wide topic, but I think that some of the elements, so how can we involve private sector in also scientific solutions, can be an interesting topic. Just to give you an example, now we see that there is a lot of use of blockchain actually also in the data, for example, required for parametric insurance, where you actually have platforms where aggregate climate information, and you can use you can purchase a small piece of data instead of buying a huge data box. You can buy a small, all you need is, for example, for a plot which is targeted for parametric insurance, so you can buy data
No, thanks for that point. And building on what Shiz had said in terms of the science of vulnerability, this possibility to push the limit in terms of engaging other stakeholders like private sector to think about science and solutions and science and implementation. Okay, so I've heard from this side of the room. I would now want to pass on any sort of one or brief reflections or questions from this side of the room. We definitely don't want you to go unheard. Anyone? Anyone further for any points? Okay. All right, so I think we're reaching this limit of saturation in terms of our discussions. So ladies and gentlemen, just a round of applause for our panelists, please. We've had very interesting conversations from the floor and from our panelists. And knowing that you have a very busy schedule over here, thank you so much. For those joining on live, we are in the final leg of the launch of the policy brief on global goal on adaptation by the World Adaptation Science Programme. I do have on my script closing remarks by the authors and moderators. In terms of, I know, Anne, you're part of the WASP team as well, and if you could say a couple of things from maybe the WASP perspective, and then I can close this. Martin's certainly not here.
Well, I'm going to be very brief so people can move to their next engagements. Just, this has been really, I think, informative also for the World Adaptation Science Programme, and some good ideas have come up, and we look forward to following up on all of that. Thank you to all of you for being here.
I also want to take this opportunity on behalf of the UN Environment Programme and the Secretariat of the World Adaptation Science Programme to thank our speakers, our presenters, Christy and Joanna, and also our audience, both here and live, for joining us for this event. We also appreciate the input in terms of the thinking of the brief, but also future priorities as well. Like I always say, there are many voices outside of this room, and that must be heard and that must be amplified, and we hope that this policy brief provides not just the science, but also those voices as well. So thank you once more for joining this event, and now please, feel free to mingle with our panelists for one-to-one conversations. I hope you do have time to mingle with the audience. Thank you so much.